few times it hasn't worked. So, all right, we'll kind of move on with our prayer list. One thing real quick though, if anybody's got coats and hats and all those kind of things, bring them to the coat closet. That's a big request that they're getting now. So, and of course we can understand why. But Herman, we've had on our prayer list that got out of the hospital, had to go back the other day. He's wearing a wound pump for a couple of weeks to drain everything out and all that. So, but he's home, moving around. His daughter's out of the medical place now, so that's good. And Gail's here with us. Jesse gets tested this week, so we're praying about that and trying to keep going there. And then Chris McCann. I have a friend named Chris McCammon. I do. Chris McCann is improving and getting a little bit better. And so, but he's still got a long ways to go to get to the point that he can get a defibrillator and hopefully not have these spells anymore. So, and then, you know, all those that don't know the joy of Christmas and the merriment, and there are some that Christmas is not joyful. So remember all of them. And so let's pray. Father, we thank you for this evening to be able to be together. We're warm, we're dry, we're safe, Lord, and we're in your house. And we just thank you for all of these parts of that. And Lord, we thank you for those that have made it possible for us to be here, that those that have carried on through this congregation for 200 years, and those that built this place, and those that have sustained it. Lord, for all the saints through all the years that have kept the faith alive, that we can know you through their witnesses to us. And Lord, as we witness, we pray for these folks that we've mentioned tonight, and that your grace and love and mercy will be upon them, Lord, and help them to recuperate, get through the things that they've got to go through. And we just pray for them all. And Lord, we just thank you that we can be in your house, we can have your word, we can gather as brothers and sisters, and we just ask that you be with us as we come to study your word and to learn about you and about your people. And all these things we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. I did talk to Meredith too. I forgot to mention that. She's getting a little better. Said she felt like somebody stuck a hose in her and sucked out all the energy. So, and that's one of the big signs of cold if you've had it. So, I had to bring my old man glasses. I got my other pair in there, but these my Clark Kent, so I'll be Superman. Superman after a while. First, you got to be strong enough to rip your clothes open, so I don't even qualify there. So we are ready for chapter 21 in the book of Genesis, and it says, "Now the Lord was gracious to Sarah, as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the very time God had promised him. Abraham gave him the name Isaac. To the son Sarah bore him, and when his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him as God commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Sarah said, God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me. And she added, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age." Now, starting right off, who was the Lord gracious to? Sarah. Now, the original promise was to whom? Abraham. And then it was to Abraham and Sarah. You know, when God appeared at the tent a year before this, and all that. But here, and it's something that we kind of miss in our culture because we mention these things, but in their cultures, this is a huge statement, because it mentions that God was gracious to the woman. The Lord was gracious to Sarah, as he said, and he did for Sarah what he promised. Most things back then, it didn't matter what happened in the family, it was accredited to the patriarch. And here it says that it was accredited to Sarah, that God was gracious to Sarah, even though the son was for and with Abraham, and that he did for Sarah what he promised. Now, what a lot of especially Hebrew scholars say is that this is another one of those proofs within the Torah that it isn't sexist. A lot of people come along and say, well, the Torah, the first 5 books, or the whole Bible in its entirety is sexist and male-centered and all that. But this is one of those things in which it shows that it is not, because there was nothing mentioned about the male here. That God's promise to Sarah, that God fulfilled it. He fulfilled it when he said he was, how he said he would, and all that for what he had promised her. So it is not just about the hymns, it's about the hers also. And, we talked about that even when we went through Acts. There's a couple of times that it mentions the woman first, or it mentions like Lydia of Thyatira. When it does that whichever name is first in the list, the closer your name is to the beginning, the more important you are. And there's a couple of times that the first time we read about them, it's the man and the woman. The second time we read about it, it's the woman and the man, which means that she had become more important in the church than he was. So it's those things when you see a woman mentioned separately, and like this and put in this way, it means that it shows us that it's not just a male-centered thing. So, because he said he did what he was going to do, and he was gracious, what happened? She became pregnant and bore a son to him in his old age, but also what was that?
Her old age.
Her old age too. So, even God knows not to make fun of a woman's age.
That's right.
So he wasn't going to talk about how old she is, but seriously, she was how old?
89,
90. 90 when he was born. And because it says that Abraham was 100 when the child was born, she was 10 years younger. So to Abraham in his old age, at the very time what? That God promised. So it wasn't earlier, it wasn't later. And what was the promise that God made to them?
By the next year.
At this time next year, it's going to happen. So Abraham gave him the name of what?
Isaac.
Yeah, Yitzhak. That is how they pronounce it, or how it would have been, almost like Yahtzee, Yitzhak. And actually, the Jews even say, most of them in their worship services and stuff say Yitzhak or Isaac, because both the A's are actually pronounced when in the translation. So we say Isaac, but it's actually Isaac or Yitzhak. Now the Yitzhak's going to come into play here in a couple of minutes, which is why I kind of wanted you to know that. But his name is Laughter, and it's the son that who bore him? Sarah. Nobody else. Which is what was it that God said? The promise, the heir to the promise will be from Sarah. So this is the point of all this. And to show that God has intervened, because Sarah was barren up to this time. And for her to be 89 years old when she got pregnant it was held off to that time to show that it could only be through the miracle of God, that God intervened, God had made his choice, and God did that with her. And they named him Laughter. Now, even with some of the names back then, that's still not a real good name. Or it's actually called He Laughs. And to have a kid, we were all talking about names a little bit ago, and kids in school and all that before we got online. And can you imagine having a kid in school now called He Laughs? It's kind of like the old Boy Named Sue thing. You'd probably be pretty tough, So, but why did Abraham name him He Laughs? Do what? Because God told him to call him that. That's exactly right. And so God had told Abraham something else, and that started when Ishmael was fairly young, and that on the 8th day, what is supposed to happen? Circumcision. And so that practice was started with Abraham and with Ishmael and with every male in his household, if you remember a couple of chapters back. And now the one thing about circumcision still today, it's considered to be the original Jewish identifier as far as the faith concerns. You have the law, you have the Ten Commandments, you have the Ten Commandments and then the law, and all those things going. But the one thing that supersedes all of it is circumcision, because it was about 400 or 500 years before the Ten Commandments and all that had been practiced through that time. And because God said, because you have that, well, let me back up a little bit. When you got those 10 Commandments, do you remember what you're supposed to not do on the Sabbath? Any kind of work, period, no matter what. And they didn't want Jesus to heal somebody's hand or anything like that. However, because circumcision preceded the law, that is something that's done on the 8-day period. It doesn't matter if it's the Sabbath. Anything else, they're going to put it off till Sunday. Sabbath is Saturday. Could put it off till Sunday. Circumcision happens 8th day, every time, every boy, everywhere, and no matter what. So he's following him. He's marking him as a Jew, as God had commanded him. So this is not a choice. It wasn't something that Abraham decided. And Abraham was about 90 or so when he was circumcised. So he's following the law, and he set that up then for all of the children of the promise, which becomes the Hebrews or the Jews or whatever you want to call them. So what does Sarah say? She kind of makes a little pun on the name here.
Everybody's gonna laugh at her.
Yeah, it said everybody. He brought me. Why not name him Laughter? He made me to laugh. Basically, it filled me with so much joy that I laughed. And who would have said that Sarah would nurse children, or who would have told Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? And in other words, nobody would have believed it. Nobody would have said anything. If someone else had said that, people would have laughed. But yet she gets the last laugh, so to speak, because now her life is filled with laughter because she has a son. And actually, that little part that's in parentheses after Sarah said is written like a little poem in Hebrew. Little rhyme, kind of a little recitation, or almost like a little song or something. And she attributes that to God. So God has brought me laughter. And she's not talking about, she's talking about both kinds, the baby and the joy. So, verse 8, the child grew and was weaned, and on the day Isaac was weaned, Abraham held a great feast. But Sarah saw that the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abraham was mocking, and she said to Abraham, "Get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that slave woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac." So, how old do you think he was when they weaned him?
Probably about
He was a
3.
lot older than they do it now.
About 3.
Yeah, somewhere between 2 and 3. Why do you think they waited that long? And that wasn't just Abraham and Sarah. That was basically the world at that time.
Famine and stuff in between, I would think. So the child still doesn't have nutrition.
Yeah, the child needed nutrition. The diets weren't that great back then. And, sometimes they ate a lot of bread. They didn't have a lot of protein. And so the mother nursed until that time in which they thought the child would survive. It just talks about Abraham circumcised him on the 8th day, and they kind of moved on. Today, the big celebration in a Jewish boy's life is the family is the circumcision. That's when he's adopted into or marked as a part of the Jewish people and all that. Back then, it was at weaning, because that meant the child was most likely going to survive, because infant mortality was so high that the best way to make sure that the child was going to survive was to nurse them for as long as possible. So somewhere between 2 and 3 years. And that's why they had a big celebration. this child has made it through the danger area, and now it looks like this child is going to live to adulthood, or at least the chances are a lot greater. And so they have a great feast, as it says here. You know, this would have been a lot of people. And so Isaac's about 2-3 years old. How old would Ishmael have been? There's 14 years between them, so he would have been 16, 17. And so what is Ishmael doing?
Making fun of him.
Your baby.
He's messing with. Now that word mocking, that's where it kind of comes in. That word, the word that's there, can be taken as mocking, laughing with, laughing at, and where Isaac's name was Yitzhak, this is Machak. The last half of the name is the same. It's where it's laughed at or laughed with. He laughs versus laughing at him, or it could be laughing with him. It could be, because it could be taken either way. It could be taking that he is messing with him, making fun of him, and all that. It could also mean that he's sitting there playing with him and making the child laugh, like a lot of times you do with a toddler and playing around with him. And now, to kind of fit into the storyline, a lot of them take it as mocking or laughing at the child. But that's not necessarily the way that it goes, because either way would work. Because what happens while they are outside together?
When Sarah and Abraham were outside together?
No, when Ishmael and Isaac are outside together, and Ishmael is doing whatever, playing with, making fun of, making laugh, whatever, mocking Isaac. Old mom looks out the window
Yeah.
and keeping her eye on things, and she sees what's going on, and what does she say?
Get rid of that slave woman and her son.
Yeah, she didn't even call him my name, right? God does in the story, Hagar the Egyptian, but Sarah says, get rid of that slave woman and her son. Because why?
Not going to inherit anything.
He is not sharing in the inheritance. Now, you know, some people look at that and they say, well, Sarah is just concerned about Isaac's wealth, is, you know, one part, because that's what, you know, you think of in the inheritance. And when we get down to right before Abraham dies, he gives, some of people say, well, he gave everything to Isaac. Well, he didn't, because it says that he had a lot more kids after that, and he gave some to this one, some to that one, he gave this one, and then the things he had left over, everything that he had left over went to Isaac. But what other inheritance might she be thinking about?
Besides land?
Besides, he didn't have any land at this time. All he had was animals and money and people.
Who led the family?
What was the big thing to begin with about Abraham and what his descendants were to have? The promised land, or what they call the promise. Descendants more than the sands on the sea, the stars in the sky, whatever, and the promised land. That was to go to his heirs. So she's looking out there seeing, there's an older son that's quite a bit older. That is the firstborn son. How were things divided up in those days? Firstborn son got it. You know, that goes all the way through the Middle Ages. And in some places still today. And so the inheritance that I think she's thinking about is not the wealth. I mean, that'd be like, you know, Bill Gates' wife or Jeff Bezos' wife looking and saying, well, there's not enough money for my kid if they, you know, if that, you can't, you know, Bill Gates has got a boy and a girl, I think. And so can you imagine if somebody said, well, you know, I don't want them sharing any inheritance. There's not enough left over if he gives some to both of them. Well, we don't say that's crazy, you know, so that's how some people are. But so I don't think it was that so much. There would have been plenty to go around. I think it is about the inheritance of the promise. She does not want that there. And even by their culture and their standards back then, it would have went there. Now, God has told Abraham what?
To do what Sarah said.
Yeah, that it doesn't go to Isaac. It doesn't go to Ishmael. It goes to Isaac. But after he's gone, then it's up to whoever wants to make the claim. And if Ishmael's 14 years older, he's already big enough that it doesn't take him much to take out the younger brother, which you see all the time back in those days.
Mm-hmm.
So in order to protect her son, she sends Ishmael and his mother away, that slave woman and her son. So verse 11, the matter distressed Abraham greatly because it concerned his son. But God said to him, do not be distressed about the boy and your maidservant. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. I will make the son of the maidservant into a nation also, because he is your offspring. So now, this is one of those places where it's a little bit, they kind of damper it a little bit. It doesn't just say that it was distressed Abraham greatly. It said it was a very bad thing in his eyes. So, it was something that he was totally against. Even if Isaac's going to be the one to get everything, Ishmael's still his son. He's still his firstborn son. He's had, 17 years he's been living with him. So, if you can imagine now. It's also one of those things that Sarah even basically said, that's her son. And sometimes those things even happen today in relationships among stepchildren and everything. Your son this, or your daughter that, or that, not my child, and that kind of thing. But here, and that it's bothering Abraham, and he sees it not just as a good thing. It wasn't just that it made him sad. He saw it as a very bad thing to send him away, because sending him away could possibly mean that's the end of him. That he's never going to see him again, or that he may starve to death, or he may come into an area that's not friendly. There's just a lot of things like that.
So Sarah never had any dealings with this slave woman's son?
No, I'm sure she didn't have much to do with her. But why does the slave woman have a son? Because Sarah said, "Take my slave woman and have a son." And then about as soon as she got pregnant, she decided that wasn't a good idea after all. And it went downhill from there. It was kind of like that old saying that, seemed like a good idea at the time, and it turned out not to be. So God comes along and says to Abraham, because God knows Abraham's that distressed, and said, "Don't worry about it. It's going to be okay. Do what she tells you to do," which tells us that Abraham wasn't planning to do what she was, or at least was considering not doing, and he would have had the final say so, but he would also had to live with Sarah. So that with all of that, and God tells him, don't be distressed about it. In other words, it's okay, it's all right. And about the boy and your maidservant. So he kind of switches the maidservant from Sarah to Abraham. And listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned, which is why I think that's what they're talking about with the inheritance. And I will make the son of the maidservant into a nation also, because he is your offspring. So he's telling him, he said he's going to be okay. He's going to have a lot of descendants. There's going to be a nation come from him. I'm going to take care of him. It's okay to go ahead and do it. So even though Sarah's motives may not have been the right way, what she was doing was within God's plan. And one of the things that it says to us is sometimes, some of the bad advice, or people advice, we need to listen to all of it and not just what sounds good, and see where God is in it and all that. So early the next morning, Abraham took some food and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar. He set them on her shoulders and sent her off with the boy. She went on her way and wandered in the desert of Beersheba. So, why do you think it was early the next morning?
So nobody knew. Nobody would know.
No,
Or maybe because of the heat.
Yeah, probably. If you're going, usually if you start a journey, if you're going to be traveling for several days, what do you usually do? You get up and leave in the morning because you don't want to waste the day. You know, what's the point in leaving at 2 o'clock in the afternoon and getting just a couple hours down the road and having to do something for the evening or whatever. So early the next morning. Now, some people do think, though, Martha, that that he was doing it so that other people wouldn't see it, and it was just kind of a little clandestine thing. I'm going to send her away. Hopefully, nobody knows, and all of that. So,
Is it possible that she could have been killed by somebody else had they seen her leaving?
do what?
Could it be that they might have been afraid that somebody would have killed them?
Yeah, or the disgrace it will look, because in that day he was still responsible for taking care of his children and not sending them off. And even there are other things in the Nunzi documents and things where it actually talks about that, which were some Arab some documents from a kingdom in that area and about that era. And so anyway, early next morning, what's he give her?
Food and water,
How much?
The skin, what's a skin?
some food.
Yeah, skin and water.
Canteen.
Yeah. Well, it could have been something that big, could have been something that big. A skin is actually a skinned animal where they skin it out, sew it all back together, and sometimes it would look like you were carrying a upside down sheep on your waist with a strap around it and carrying it. Or sometimes, because it wasn't they used to use bladders a lot. It wasn't a bladder, I would have mentioned that. This is a skin. So this would have been quite a bit of water. If you can think of how much water would be in something that was about the size of a lamb or a goat or something along that line. And which was common in those days. That's how they stored a lot of liquids. They didn't have a lot of pottery and all of that. So,
Why wouldn't the boy have carried that instead of her?
well, we're going to get to that. But how much food did they get sent?
Some bread.
Some. Does that sound like very much?
Mm-mm.
Nope. So he sets them on her shoulders. Now, one of the things that's kind of debated. So this boy is at least 16, if not 17. But he puts them on his mother's neck. Now, don't you think that he'd be big enough to carry it? But it's but there's a couple of different things about it. Number one, who's the slave and who is the heir?
The mother's a slave.
The mother's the slave. The son is the heir. That could be part of it. Part of it could be that he is showing the transfer of authority from him to her over the boy. Here are all the provisions. I'm giving the provisions to you, and now you are the one that's in charge, both for her and for Ishmael's sake. So he sets them on her shoulder, and then sent her off with the boy. Now ours is phrased correctly. The way that it says he put them on her shoulder with the boy is kind of how the original reads, which you can depends on how you divide it out. That he put. You could also almost read it that he put the skin, the food, and the boy on her shoulder, but it basically means that he put the boy in her care to go along. And so he sends them off. And she went on her way and wandered in the desert of Beer-sheba. So where's Beer-sheba?
I don't know. You're gonna tell us.
It's actually in just about if you take from the Mediterranean Ocean to the Dead Sea, just about in the middle of the southern part of Israel. That's kind of where it is, just north of Saudi Arabia. It is the southernmost tip of Israel, and it's not Israel yet, but it was for centuries. It was still that area is considered the southern tip. Well, it kind of goes down along the Dead Sea now. And then there was a northern tip, was Dan, and there's, how we say from coast to coast, or California to LA, or something along that line. You'll see the phrase when you get into the Kings, and from the time there's a king and on, from the time the territories are all laid out, from Dan to Beersheba, which means same as we'd say from coast to coast, from top to bottom, is what they're saying, and because it was long and narrow, wasn't real long. So now we haven't read anything about Beersheba. We're going to. It's actually the next thing we're going to talk about is how it got its name. It actually means either the well of the oath or the well number 7. It can be either one, but it is a well. Anytime you see Beer, fastened to a word that is, it's not beer, but it is a drink. It is water. That means well, be'er, be'er. And so this is the well of something. So anytime you see that, all it's just like BETH is house of, and EN is a spring, and just some things along that line that's in some of the names. So she's wandering around. Now this could have been a day, 2 days, 3 days, and they're out. It's also at the edge of the desert, so it wouldn't have been good. So when the water in the skin was gone, this verse 15, when the water in the skin was gone, she put the boy under one of the bushes. Then she went off and sat down nearby, about a bow shot away, for she thought, I cannot watch the boy die. And as she sat there nearby, she began to sob. Or some translations say he began to sob. God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation. So the water is gone, and she's wandering in the area of what? A well, or in the area of that well. It may not have been that well yet, but so she puts the boy under one of the bushes. And what kind of bushes you think were there? It was something that we read about before with Abraham living there. I just happen to have a picture. A couple of them, tamarisk trees.
And they call that a bush.
Well, it can look like that. It can look like that. But one of the things that you notice, what do you notice about it on the ground? It's really heavy shade. Tamarisk trees also had a way, kind of a especially when they were this size, they kind of had a self-evaporating thing. So moisture that would come out of the leaves and evaporate, which gave it a cooling effect, and the cool would come down. So and they're sparse and they're scattered out, and this is a grove, considered a grove. You can see a couple more in that area and that kind of thing. But they're usually, you find them like this, which single and all that. So she sticks him underneath a shrub, underneath a bush, and we're going to see that there were tamarisk trees in that area with the next story. So she puts him under the bush, and what does she do?
Bow shot.
Oh, bow shot.
How far can you shoot a bow and arrow? A couple 100 yards.
I can't, but some people can.
Yep. Well, even 100 yards. So why did she go that far away?
Because she didn't want to see him die.
She didn't want to see him die. And so now, it's one of those things you kind of wonder about and say, how many mothers would set their son down and say, I don't want to watch you die. I'm going to go off far enough that I can't hear you crying. So it's one of those things that just doesn't make sense, but that's what she did. That she couldn't stand the thought that he was going to cry. Now, she should have known better, because she was also told. I thought I had it that. You're now with child, and you will have a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man, and his hand will be against everyone's hand, and he will live in hostility towards all of his brothers. So does that sound like he's going to die at 17 years old? And who'd she hear that from? From God, from the angel. So she's kind of let the circumstances overcome what she's been told by God. So do you think that ever happens?
Oh, yeah.
All the time. And so it's basically the same thing as Peter getting out on the water and starting to sink. He let the circumstances overcome his faith. But she sets the boy down, and so she goes off. So she doesn't want to watch the boy dry. And then either he or she, depends on your translation, begins to cry. So now verse 17 kind of lends us to believe that the boy was crying, because that's what it says, or at least that's what verse 16 meant. Or it could have been both of them were crying, but it didn't say that God heard her crying. What does it say?
Heard the boy,
And what was the boy's name?
Ishmael.
Ishmael.
Which is God hears. His name is God Hears. And that's what the thing was about the name. And so that's what she said, that you're the God who has seen me. And so she was told to name him God Hears, because that was the whole thing. God heard her plight, heard all that. And so it's kind of a little pun here. So what's the name of the boy? God Hears. The boy's crying, and what happens? God hears. And the angel of God called out to her and said, what? Some people read this like, well, what's the matter, Hagar? To me, it's like the angel saying, what's the problem? So don't be afraid. What, don't you remember? And so, God has heard. Again, we have that God hears. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Lift the boy up, take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation. Now, that doesn't mean pick him up and carry him. Just like you would, grab him by the hand, help him up, get going. And so if he's going to be a great nation, that means what? He's going to make it. He's going to survive, and that they're going to be okay. You got to have food and water, right? So then, verse 19, then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water. So she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy as he grew up. He lived in the desert and became an archer. While he was living in the desert of Paran, his mother got a wife from him from Egypt. So she's there. She's so concentrated on her problems that she's out of water, that she doesn't see what? The well that's there. That she doesn't see that what she needs is right in front of her. And just kind of open your eyes. I read those things. I always think about how many times my mom told me and my brother, just open your eyes and look. It's right there in front of you. So, and so she gives the boy water, and so then he lives where?
Desert.
And became a
Archer.
And she had said how far away?
Bow shot.
A bow shot. So there's little play there in words, that. So, and that's where you kind of know of where it kind of comes from. How would she know what a bow shot was, or how would they judge that? Because he was an archer, and so where did his wife get him a wife, or did his mom get a wife? Why did she get him one from Egypt? She was Egyptian. If you remember back to the Sarah story, she was an Egyptian slave, so she went back to her people to get a wife for him, because he would have been half Egyptian. So now, seems like a simple story, right? So why isn't it?
I don't know. I haven't got that far yet.
This story has been a contention for 4,000 years. People have fought. People are still fighting because of this for 4,000 years. So what do you think the fight is over?
The Arabs and the Israelites.
The area of the Israelites. The promised land. Who is the rightful heir to the promised land? Is it the descendants of Ishmael, or is it the descendants of Isaac? And the descendants of Isaac are called the Jews. The descendants of Ishmael are, well, we really don't know. There's not anything in there that really lays it out. However, it was fought back and forth that since about 670 something, Muhammad said in the Quran that the Arabs were descendants of Ishmael. There's really you can't make, and some Bible scholars teach that because it's just kind of been one of those things that people accept, just like the wise men at the manger scene and things, because they've just heard it, seen it, and all of that. So when they're talking about whose land is what over in Israel, it comes back to this. The Arabs say that Sarah stole it from Ishmael and sent him off. The Jews say, no, God gave it to Isaac. And so whichever way that comes down is the way that people are coming down. That's why there's a lot of the hatred that are what you have is ours. Why they both claim it to be their land or their property, or that God, both sides claim God gave it to them. Just that whether Sarah stole it or rightfully claimed it, and so it goes. There are some that go all the way back to that, and which is one of those things why it may never get settled. So now, verse 22, the treaty at the well. At that time, Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his forces, said to Abraham, God is with you in everything you do. Now swear to me here before God that you will not deal falsely with me or my children or my descendants. Show to me and the country where you are living as an alien the same kindness I have shown to you. Abraham said, I swear it. Now, Abimelech is the last one that Abraham kind of conned, with Sarah. We read that last time, that she's my sister, he's my brother, and that they were all the wombs were closed up and God had afflicted them and all that kind of stuff. So as Abimelech's coming to Abraham, he knows two things. Number one, he's probably thinking Abraham can't truly be trusted, right? Because he's already deceived him once. He didn't exactly lie to him. He just didn't tell him the whole truth. And because Abraham said, well, we are brother and sister. We have the same father, just different mothers. And so that's a technicality that we're just having to be married to. But so he's done that. Plus he has seen that God's with him because God intervened. And Abimelech had the dream where God said, you're as good as dead. You touch that woman, you and everybody's you're all going to die. And Abimelech says, Lord, I haven't touched her. I haven't done anything. And it actually said that the Lord says, I prevented you from touching her because you've been innocent up to this point. Now what are you going to do? So God himself has intervened with Abimelech on Abraham's side. So he knows God's on Abraham's side. You can't really trust Abraham. So what's the first thing he does when he comes to see him? We need to talk, but the first thing you need to do is swear to me that you are going to be truthful and honest. Now, how many of us, if somebody came up to you and said, I need to talk to you about a business dealing or a property matter, but the first thing you have to do is put your hand on the Bible, raise your right hand, and swear after me. Most of us get honked off. But what does Abraham do? He says, all right, I swear. No sense arguing about it. Don't get your feelings hurt. Let's just
But we
move
do
on.
do that sometimes.
Huh?
We do that sometimes.
Well, sometimes we have to legally.
Well, no, but I want to tell you something, but you have to swear to me you're not going to tell him.
No, but that's not the same as saying, I want to make a deal with you and I want you to swear with me you're going to be honest.
Okay.
That's a whole different. Now, having somebody swear to secrecy, that's a whole different thing. But this is, okay, that guy you guys sold all your stuff to, if he come into you and he said, now, Mary Jane, first, before we have this kind of dealing, you're gonna have to promise to me you're gonna be honest because I don't trust you.
You're right.
I wouldn't want to be there here to answer. But that's what's being said
Okay.
here. And Abraham just takes it because he knows I probably deserve it. And he just says, I swear it. No commentary or anything. He just says, okay. So then, verse 25. So, and what was that problem? Hey, we've been nice to you. You be nice to us and to all of the people that come after me in my country. And your people, deal with me the same way, same kindness I've shown you. You are an alien here. This is not your land. This is my land. And we've treated you nicely, so please do it for us as well. And don't deal falsely. Remember, you haven't been truthful with him, so don't deal falsely with me or my children or my descendants. And that's when he says, okay, I will. And so that's their first little covenant there, their first promise. But then Abraham has a problem that he comes back to him after they say, okay, we're going to be fair with each other. And Abraham says, okay, well, by the way, verse 25. Then Abraham complained to Abimelech about a well of water that Abimelech's servants had seized. But Abimelech said, I don't know who has done this. You did not tell me, and I heard about it only today. So Abraham brought sheep and cattle and gave them to Abimelech, and the two men made a treaty. Abraham set apart 7 ewe lambs from the flock, and Abimelech asked Abraham, what is the meaning of these 7 ewe lambs you have set apart by themselves? And he replied, accept these 7 lambs from my hand as a witness that I dug this well. So that place was called the Well of the Oath, because the 2 men swore an oath there. After the treaty had been made at Beersheba, Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of the forces, returned to the land of the Philistines. Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba, and there called upon the name of the Lord, the eternal God, and Abraham stayed in the land of the Philistines for a long time. So he's there a long time. Now, one of the things that they would do back then is, because if you can imagine, I mean, just if you took this tree out and you look way on back in here, you don't see any kind of trees, or even on this one, And so what they would do sometimes is they would plant a tree at the well, so that as you're traveling along and you're trying to find that well, you could be miles off and look over there and say, there's the tree. That's the way we have to go. And actually, I saw a program, been 3 or 4 years ago, about some nomads today that still travel hundreds of miles. And it's women that make this journey, the older women with the young girls, kind of a rite of passage. And the old gal in the front she's the only one that knows where the well is. And when she gets close, she looks for the bush because otherwise it just looks like sand, but there's almost a funnel type thing where this bush is. And that's kind of why they would do some of that. Now, one thing I forgot to mention, Phicol, they think that's either a position, saying that he's a general, or it's either a last name, because that name's mentioned several other times throughout the Bible. So it's there's got to be something more to it. That's not some dude's first name like Abimelech is. So anyway, Abraham says, hey, your servant stole a well from us. And Abimelech says, I don't know anything about it, and this is the first I've heard of it. And so, and now does Abraham doubt him? You don't see Abraham swearing him to honesty, because Abimelech hasn't lied to him or anything yet. So he brings out all these animals and that he happens to have with him. They might have just been in his flock, but it appears he brought some with him, maybe thinking he's going to have to buy it back, or they're going to make a sacrifice, or whatever they're going to do. But what does he do with the animals from the flock? He picks 7. And why 7?
God's number.
This little passage here, 7, 7 is the completeness or fullness or whatever. A couple of interesting things in this story: Abraham is mentioned 7 times. Abimelech is mentioned 7 times. There were 7 ewes that were traded, and also the Beersheba well of. It can either be the oath, or it can be the 7th well, or the well of 7. So it may be the 7th well that they dug, that they finally hit water, or it may have been. Now most people carry it on through because of what follows right after that in verse 31, because the 2 of them swore an oath there. It's called the Well of the Oath, and it's that well that they were at that we just read about Ishmael and Hagar. So they get this all settled. Basically, they make an agreement, and so it's not a matter now. It was Abraham's well. Abimelech's forces took it from him. Abraham gives him this flock back so that they can't say that nothing ever exchanged hands, that it is a traded piece of property now. He has accepted something in return for it. So you don't accept something in return for something that, you don't accept money for a sale of something if you haven't sold it, right? So that's kind of where it is here, to show that it does now belong to Abraham and his descendants. Because when you bought something like that, it wasn't, unless you sold it again, it stayed in your family. And so Abraham plants his tamarisk tree there and calls upon the name of the Lord, the eternal God. And that eternal God, that is a term that is unique to this passage. It's actually El Olam, and there's several different passages in which God is referred to in a different way. Here it's the eternal. There's God. There's Almighty God, El Shaddai. This is the eternal God. There's a lot of different ones that goes along with that. So to kind of, for every person saying this is a different aspect of God. And we even have a song that has a bunch of those names in it. Do you know what that song is called? It's in our hymnal. El Shaddai. El Shaddai. And I'm not going to try to pronounce all those names that Amy Grant sings about in there, but it's in the hymnal. You want to look it up. There's several of them in there. So why else would he plant a tamarisk tree there? These things lasted for years and years and years. So it wasn't, this one here is probably 100 years old or something, which is why the difference between this one versus that one. That one looks like it's getting old and scruggly, but.
Are they still there?
I don't know if it's still there. The well's still there. There is a well at that location that the locals still say it traces all the way back to Abraham, and that this is Abraham's well. So that is there is a well there, and now it's in the land of the what? Philistines. So here Abimelech, basically at this point the king of what's going to become the Philistines, and Abraham, the head of what is going to become the Jews, they make this agreement to be what? Friendly with one another. And for how long?
Long time.
For a long time, through all their descendants and all that. Does it last? Who was the greatest enemy that we read about? And that was in that general area. There were the Assyrians, which were up to the north. There was the Babylonians and all that, which were the major empires. But without it being a major empire, one of the 6 or 7 major empires, their nemesis throughout most of the time of the Jewish nation was the Philistines. And Goliath was a Philistine. Saul fought the Philistines. David fought the Philistines. They fought the Philistines for a long time. You know what we call them today? Or that area, instead of calling it Philistine? The Gaza Strip. You ever heard that term? That's the land of the Philistines, the 5 cities. Ashdod, Gaza, which is why they call it the Gaza Strip, and 3 others. But that's the ancient towns that were there that you read about. It's still that same area today, along the Mediterranean Ocean, just about due west of the Dead Sea, and there's a strip that's there. That's called the Gaza Strip, because Gaza is one of the ancient Philistine towns still around, and that's how they refer to it. So when you hear people talk about the Gaza Strip, they're talking about what was ancient Philistines. And so we'll kind of get into the first sentence or two on this next part, because we'll be at least the whole next session talking about it. But this is probably the one thing that everybody knows about Abraham more than others. So sometime later, God tested Abraham, and he said to him, "Abraham, here I am," he replied. So starting with just this first part. So, how long was he in the area of the Philistines or in Beersheba?
Long time.
A long time. And then, sometime later. You know, kind of like the old stories. Meanwhile, back at the ranch. So, you know, this has been a while. Now, how long is a while? I don't know. It really doesn't say. It is several years, we're going to see, because of the interaction of Isaac and Abraham. That Isaac had to be a boy that was probably in his early teens, is what I would guess. So they've been there for a while. So if he's in his early teens, then they've been there at least 10 years or so between these two stories. And so it comes time for God to do what with Abraham? To test him. So what's the difference between a test and a tempt? Somebody being tempted or somebody being tested? There's a definite difference in the Bible, and in the way that it's referred to. Jesus was tempted. We all get tempted. Sometimes we get tested. Some people say Jesus was tested in the garden, although I don't know that I necessarily agree with that, but I can see where they think that.
Because of the act.
Yeah, it's actually, what do you intend for the end result to be? God never tempts, and basically Satan never tests. The difference between them is when you are tempted, you are being, somebody's trying to get you to do wrong. You know, the outcome of a tempt, if you are tempted and you fail in that, then you have sinned and sinned greatly. It is when Satan tempts, he is enticing you to do the wrong thing. With the repercussions are going to come from that. Now, Miss Teacher down there at the end, what is the purpose of a test?
To see if you've learned anything.
To see if you learned it. Hey, that's a good way to put it. Martha said it's to see if you learned anything, and to also, we put grades on them, right? And the purpose of the grades is to see what level are you. Where are you? Where are you when, you know, how good did you do the test? So the difference is, one is enticing us to do wrong and to commit a sin. The other one is to say sometimes, how strong is your belief? What are you willing to do for God? If you fail a test, it never ends up as a sin. You know, it may mean that you haven't done what you needed to do, but you haven't gone against God. It just means you didn't measure up. You know, when you take a driving test, they're trying to find out, you know, can you drive? Do you have the skills and the knowledge and everything that it takes? So when God tests us here with Abraham, as God is maybe not even measuring Abraham's. God is not trying to find out what he knows about Abraham. He's trying to get Abraham to see where is the faith. And it's showing all of us. One of the things that I think, Martha, that the teacher in the room can correct me if I'm wrong, but most teachers could pretty well tell you before a test what the letter grade is going to be of every kid that takes it. She's given one of those down there. So, you know, so most teachers, including God, know what the outcome is going to be. But it is to prove to us what is the outcome. Are we as smart? Are we as good as we thought? Are we better than we thought? And all those. So that is the point of the test, and why this is a test and not a tempt. And in my opinion, and we'll get into it the next time, of course, I think this is one of the most misconstrued stories of the Bible when it comes to that testing and what Abraham thought and what Abraham was doing and where he came from. And there are clues in the story of Abraham's faith, not just at the end, but all the way through. So we'll actually, let me finish up with he said, "Here I am." That is a special term. It's not like saying, you know, I'm over here. That is almost a military term that says, Yes, sir.
Recording.
Yeah, yeah. And it's I am here and ready is what it means. It's not just it's not even a I'm listening. It is at your service is maybe a way to put it. So we'll pick up with verse 2 next time. So hope you all have a good week. Go out and be blessed and be a blessing. And we'll catch you on the next round.